My presentation is titled What UNDP Really Means by Development and Why It Matters. It is going to go to a different direction as what we have been talking so far. Of course, it's tied to narratives, but at the same time, it's going to talk about the international arena and a very specific field, which is development. So the outline of my presentation is going to be narratives and the prominence in social sciences, just so I tie my presentation to today's conference theme. Then I'm going to talk about the mainstream development narratives and the theoretical framework, which I'm going to use to go about the research question that I proposed is critical development studies. And the analysis is based on a discourse analysis that I did, as well as it's still in a work in process, and the text analysis on the Human Development Report published by the UNDP in 2020. The reason why I choose this one is because this is the most recent completed report so far, and I'm going to have some concluding remarks as well. Let's just talk a bit about the narratives and specifically their relation to policy agendas. So as you can see, the definition that I use is based on Göschke's and her colleagues' work, which says that social constructions that describe reality in a teleological way, that is exactly what narratives does. And that is they provide a more or less coherent framework of meaning that allows people to locate, perceive, identify, and label events, concepts, and objects in the world as well. So we can if we really want to simplify it, that means that narratives in itself shape the reality in which we live in. Just to mention Lakoff's and Johnson's work, Metaphors We Live By, in that they clearly research how conceptual metaphors and narratives constitute frame and implicate specific policy agendas. And to give just an example to better grasp my idea here is that, for example, when it comes to development, there is always this big question between whether we should apply a top-down or bottom-up approach. When we talk about top-down approach, we would somehow mean that it would imply the Western export of liberal institutions, the rule of law, and free market when it comes to this specific development narrative. And that would mean that our policy agenda should focus on development of institutions and legislature. However, if we would say that a more bottom-up approach is needed, that would mean that our narratives is usually more based on people and local knowledge production, and that would mean that the focus is going to be on increasement of local capabilities and community resilience, for example. So we can say that narratives are shaping our understanding of the world, for sure, and they also have this value that they justify and legitimize political actions and social practices, and this is what I think is going to be very important. The analysis that I'm going to talk about is specifically mentioning why such a big UN organization, what they think and how they narrate development is really legitimize the programs that they imply to achieve certain type of development goals. The narratives of mainstream development approaches, I felt like it would be an interesting way to start from here. And the emancipatory claims of mainstream development projects were launched after the 1945, I would say, around. And that means that the biggest idea was designed to set developing countries on the path to capitalist modernity. So this was the idea behind the developing countries need to catch up to the modern world. And that would mean substantive social change, such as institutional reforms or modernization, as well as a very deep and intertwined international cooperation. And from there on, we can always, I would say it's easy to, this is my intention at least, is that the taken for granted assumption that capitalism provides the best, if not the only system to achieve this type of a goal of modernization led to the virtual disappearance of any mention, let alone theorization of capitalism when it comes to these development projects. And from there on, we can talk about development decades. I feel like it's a very risky decision to just say decades, because usually they are not clearly defined borders within these decades, but we can still talk about them. And this decades, usually how I would configure them is that it gives a strategic response to changing conditions. So you can always see what was the problem and what was their reaction to it. So the first 2 decades was majorly dominated by economic terms. It was mostly, as I told, was about modernization and institutionalization. And it lasted for more than 2 decades. And this approach assumed that economic growth would only happen with the adoption of Western cultural and institutional practices and would be led by state and their functionaries in both North and the South. And it lasted, as I told you, like for 2 decades. But then we could see around like the 70s, there was this big boom of the need for social reforms because inequality is starting to appear more gravely, and that kind of propagated within the development specialists to talk about social reforms and an enhanced role and give an enhanced role of the state. However, in the 80s already there was a big strategic change, and we talk now then in conservative counter-revolution. It is a really quick sequence. Now I'll talk about these events, but just to save some time, in the 80s we were mostly talking about deregulation, liberalization, and privatization was kind of universally prescribed within the Washington Consensus to the whole world intentionally. And specifically, we can say that from the 1990s, an irreversible trend towards a global economy has been observable. We call it globalization. This is very heavily based on the neoliberal agenda. And for developing countries, that meant that there appeared to be no alternative to deeper integration into the circus of trade and capital flows. The Tina effect, which specifically meant there is no alternative, was accompanied by extravagant claim for beneficial results of globalization. The World Bank in 1995 even got as far as saying that the globalization could bring untold prosperity to developing countries, provided they open their economies to unrestricted report and capital flows. However, I would say now it's kind of safe to say that we live in a world disfigured by poverty, inequality, multiple injustices, and planetary threats. So we can kind of establish this assumption that globalization, and let alone the sequence of these mainstream development approaches, do have certain type of shortcomings in their narrative, how they talk about development. So to go about my question, I applied the theoretical framework of critical development studies. This means that while previously it was argued that the capitalist, it is still argued that the capitalist system is so taken for granted that in many occasions development equals capitalism. So there is no theorization of development outside of the framework of capitalism in itself. However, critical development studies require either transformative change, which means an overhaul of the system, or abandonment of capitalism in favor of an alternative system. But there are also different types of these alternatives as well. It is a quite broad and heterogeneous interdisciplinary field, and it also seeks to explain why and how and where these alternatives might be found. And just to give one another example, in relation to development, migration is always a big question. And when it comes to mainstream development approaches, when it comes to international migration, the questions they would propose is what is the value of remittances, for example, they send back to their origin country, or they would either ask questions about what are the skill sets of the immigrants arriving into host countries and how they can contribute to the economic there. However, from a critical perspective, what critical development scholars would focus on is rather the dynamics of contemporary capitalist accumulation, which kind of produces this surplus population for which is a necessity to migrate. They would also focus on geopolitical rivalries, insecurities, which create refugees, racial and gender hierarchies within the migration process as well, and other prospect of resistance. And of course, different scholars go formulate their thoughts on development either in a more radical or in a more let's put it mainstream way. For example, I very much like this quote from Ronald Munch, who said that development begins to appear as a disciplinary mechanism in a Foucauldian sense, which I feel like is a rather powerful explanation of how critical development scholars think about these mainstream approaches, which I previously mentioned. And of course, within critical development studies, there are also new concepts emerge, such as maldevelopment, anti-development, and post-development, which are different things. It's just because of the lack of time, I don't have the confidence to get into them. But to start my analysis, I would say that Gustavo Esteva in 1992 said that the conceptual inflation of development, which we were talking when we were talking about the mainstream development approaches, had led it to dominate almost all treatment of the non-Western world. The development seems to act like as a metaphor for the Western way of life. And then my question was, does UNDP, which also takes a quite major role when it comes to all these development programs, also conceptualize development this way? And to see that, I was looking at the 2020 Human Development Report. The title of it is The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene. And because of lack of time I have here, I mostly want to focus on one concept that they mention. Even in their title, there is the concept of the Anthropocene, which appears more than 280 times, which does mean that it's relevant through the whole document itself, through the 300 pages. And this was the paragraph you can see on the slide. This was one of the paragraphs opening, which they used. I would say intentionally, that would, just as a gut feeling, that would mean that they are kind of trying to open up to these diversified knowledge production sources, or they are kind of open to the idea to generate alternative development discourses. However, I still did find certain type of criticism, which I would say is relevant regarding Anthropocene usage in the UNDP's discourse. So some would say, who are the proponents of the usage of Anthropocene, could argue that it is good if we use Anthropocene within the development discourse, because it's like this confidence in modernity. So we kind of already with using it, we kind of establish a new type of a narrative. However, there always can be this question that this is a one-word term, which means that what can be lost and not captured in such a term? I mean, like the heterogeneity and also this like super extremely rapidly changing world that we live in. Can it really be encompassed in only one term? Also, these criticisms can be applied to the Anthropocene literature in itself, but I also felt like it was very relevant when it comes to the UNDP's narratives, specifically in this report, is that it was all collected by Balik. And it says that the Anthropocene encouraged, the core concept of it is that human activity is having a dominating presence in multiple aspects of the world, a natural world, and the functioning of the Earth system, and that this has a consequence for how we view, interact with the natural world and perceive our place in it. But that means this whole Anthropocene literature is very much coming from this Western, very technocratic culture of framing of the word. Does mean that development specialists who are coming from this cultural mindset will always tend to favor technocratic approaches, materialistic conceptualization of, and responses to the contemporary environmental change, which is usually the way how Anthropocene is used in the report. And it may also encourage macro-scale system use of managing the Anthropocene, such as planetary geoengineering guided by a global enlightened elite community of scientist manager, I very much like that word, rather than approaches that better recognize the complexity and heterogeneity of cultural and natural systems. So it is very much just as an answer to critical development studies, what their usual critique is. The grand narrative of Anthropocene may also encourage a sense of historical inevitability and grand destiny, which means that the surge in environmental degradation is an inevitable consequence of general human progress rather than a particular consequence of specific economic structure or power dynamics. So by using this term, we kind of reiterate this grand narrative, and we kind of, in one hand, we can wash our hand and say that this is kind of the natural process of human development, rather than this is something that is, for example, can be coming from this grand idea of modernization and capitalism as such. Related criticism, once again, can be that by talking about one type of a human nature relation, we kind of encompass humanity into one group. This does mean that people in the developing world is treated as much as people coming from this very Western technocratic world, which of course, like by the time now, we already could see in many different occasions that there is common but differentiated responsibility. This is also a term that is very much used here. It is impossible to think that everyone is responsible in the same way. So even saying that we are all humans we could need, I would say there needs to be still more theorization of how we mean this word in itself. And just two more concluding remarks, which I think is very much relevant about the report and why does it matter how UNDP conceptualize development and the usage of this Anthropocene term, is because there is a great standing paradox in the report, which is coming from the frequently preached capability of approach of Amartya Sen and the usage of within the concept of the Anthropocene. I think it in itself is a paradox, because if we take Amartya Sen's capability approach, that is very much based on this very orthodox way of interpreting the difference between agency and structure. However, if you coming from this literature based on the Anthropocene, it already tried to bypass this whole dichotomy. So it's really about merging together agency and structure, which is created, as I said, a paradox with this very orthodox way of interpreting capability, agency's capability. And also Chandler in a textbook of international relation in the Anthropocene also formulates that the usage of the term also challenges the standing dichotomies of many disciplines. And I think it's very relevant for all the scholars, but specifically when it comes to research in IR, for example, the usual distinction between us and the security referent, how we securitize, is going to be can be interpreted in a very different way if we try to capture it in the Anthropocene than if we would do it in the normal conceptual, not normal, but the mainstream conceptual work that we are live right now. So the conceptualized narrative does define different modes of actions, as I told in the beginning. So I would say my biggest, my main takeaway from my presentation, which is still a work in progress, but it says that highlighting the lack of alternative narratives in international development and the dominance of mainstream development approaches can urge scholars and development specialists to broaden the conceptual framework of their operation outside of the neoliberal capitalist agenda to be capable to react to imminent crises such as the pandemic or the climate crisis that is more and more imminent day by day. To achieve that, a more inclusive narrative and vocabulary has to be created, which includes diversified knowledge production sources and practices, and does not solely rely on Western technocratic development conceptualizations. And that would be my presentation. Thank you.